Hello, everybody. Welcome to Birkbeck, if this is your first time at Birkbeck. And certainly welcome to the Social Sciences Festival. As a colleague was saying earlier, is the festival, it was you actually, sorry, is the festival the whole day long? Well, no, we're evening teaching place, and there's been an event every week. And I'm delighted that we've got, as you'll see now, a really interesting range of Birkbeck connected folks who are working on food. Some of them are doing a PhD in the School of Social Sciences. We have one sister brotherly representative from the School of Cultural Studies. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but just to tell you a little bit about how we thought about this event, and that is really to showcase what has been a small, but I think quite perfectly formed and effective tradition of teaching and researching and learning about food in its broadest understanding at Birkbeck and in the School of Social Sciences, its predecessors in the Department of Politics, Department of Geography. Just last week, we had a tribute to Sami Zubaida, who was an emeritus professor and unfortunately died earlier in April, and was the doyen of the sociology of food, not just in Birkbeck, but elsewhere, and who inspired myself and colleagues who are here present, most notably Dr. Jason Edwards here on my right, to put our money where our mouth was, as it were, and do a course on food, politics, and society, which we taught for over a decade. I've forgotten how long that course ran for. We also had different workshops, food group, eventually published a book, just to put a little commercial out there, called Food, Politics, and Society. And some of the people on this round table, to say, will introduce themselves in just a moment, were active participants in that as teaching in that course, being PhD students connected to the activities that we're doing. And I think, therefore, it's a real pleasure in the literal sense to show off how all that work across different years has paid off, with a couple of colleagues who went on from their PhD to get gainful employment and are teaching in different London institutions on food-related areas. Other colleagues who are still at the heart of the issue, some even beginning at the foothills of the PhD process. But all of them, I think, have very interesting things to say, I hope, around the theme of today's session, which is on belonging, identity, and sustainability. I'm going to welcome in a slightly, this always freaks me out a little bit, because I think it's just, it's a few other people joining us online. So hello, everybody. I can see you by move around, but hopefully you can see and hear us. And Ben, who, by the way, is the colleague who organised this whole festival. So thank you, Ben, for putting this opportunity together. If you cannot hear us, let us know. I'm going to go around, ask each of you very briefly to say who you are and what you're currently doing, and then I'm going to do a roundtable in the strictest sense of going round and ask the participants a question. That sounds like it wasn't anything bad. Okay, they can. Fantastic. I should have said that my name is Alex Colas, and I teach international relations, as it happens, in the School of Social Sciences. But as you've now heard, together with other colleagues, very much interested in agri-food systems, which of course have a global dimension. So let me start with Rolando. Just briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Rolando, and my research, I guess, is bringing together food security and science fiction or speculative fiction. So I look at ways we can think more creatively about sustainability, but specifically through a food security lens. And that's kind of, yeah, I think it was very inspired by Dune, if anyone's seen the movie, and the use of water. And yeah, just, I think it's such a, well, I think we're seeing it now with AI and the technology and the way that it's progressing. Like science fiction is just not as sciencey anymore. it's very much so in our faces. So yeah.
Maddie.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a first-year PhD student, and my research is looking at cultural appropriateness and food security in public food provision, specifically in school meals in London. So my interest is food security in urban centres, and I'm looking at food security through the lens of cultural appropriateness. So yeah, that's sort of linked to my master's research, although that was on allotment gardens, but it was based also in London. So yeah.
Ashima Gandhi. I completed my PhD last year from Birkbeck. Alex is my supervisor. My research was on the politics of belonging through food. So a lot of what we talk about today will be hopefully very relevant to what I researched last year, or for the last 5 years. I'm currently teaching, regrettably not anything to do with food. It's in criminology and politics, but eventually I'll get back to food.
Thank you. Lucia.
Hi, I'm Lucia, and I'm a PhD student in psychosocial studies, and I am focusing on the Peruvian mixed-race community and their subjectivity and their identity and their relationship with a system and a social structure that is still very colonial in nature. And I'm doing that through their engagement with Peruvian food and the culinary landscape in Peru. I'm still a newbie, so just passed my upgrade and I'm gonna go do my field work very soon. So I have a lot of ideas about how this is gonna go. It could go, but we'll see.
Thank you. Rowan.
My name's Rowan Lubbock. I'm a senior lecturer in the political economy of development at Queen Mary University. In my previous research, I was looking at the politics of food sovereignty in Venezuela, sort of between 2015 and 16. And my current project has shifted its focus, sort of widened its lens a little bit into a long-term archival project on the role of modern agriculture in the making of international order and disorder.
So I'm going to start with Ashima and with your work on South Asian women in the UK. What is the significance of food in that identity?
Yeah. I think the sort of relationship between British and Indian food cultures is obviously very complicated, goes back many, many centuries. I'm not going to talk about colonization too much, but just to say that has everyday sort of significance in the way that people deal and talk about food, how they consume food. So what I was looking at, what got me really interested was actually looking at the different sort of arrivals of diasporas. So around the 60s, the kind of relationship that people had with food, sort of the surgence of curry houses that people might be very familiar with, perhaps some of you dined in curry houses, it's very different to the kinds of food that people that were of a later diaspora migration came to. Very different sort of experiences. The kinds of food that they were eating in this country is very different from the food that they actually grew up with and were familiar with. And that kind of ambivalence and tension between not just the clash of new migrants and host communities, but within the diasporas themselves is really, really interesting. As it relates to gender, I think it's one of those things that we might have a general understanding of patriarchal societies and kind of the role of women in the kitchen. What I found was really interesting is that these spaces are also not necessarily just wholly bad. They're not just completely full of violence. It's actually sometimes an escape from violence as well. So some of these women that live in joint homes, so you've got a ton of families living in one shared space, they do have that responsibility. It's that labor of love is often how it's sold, but they're spending all of their time also being social with other women in the house. They also get to escape a bit of violence that might occur in the family, especially gendered violence. And that kind of relationship makes it a very complicated, very tension-filled, and very ambivalent with how they actually find food. A lot of times it's not pleasure. A lot of times it is chore. Sometimes there's also pleasure. Sometimes there's pleasure in not cooking. And those things are very complicated. And I think negotiating a sense of identity through those complexities changes all of the time. So nobody has like just one singular relationship as such, but it's obviously very informed by all of these everyday experiences and how families themselves are, how communities are, how the state is. All of those have an impact.
Mm-hmm. So there's some keywords I'm hearing already, which is ambivalence, pleasure, which I think is a very powerful term in relation to food. Obviously, we're going to be talking about food insecurities and inequalities and injustices, but I think we can all speak, certainly around this round table, for the simple pleasures, the small breaks that food and sometimes drink offers us. But just to go a little bit deeper into how that experience, which of course we're talking about in singular, but is very diverse, how has it changed? How's the relationship between food, South Asian women, their identities, their experiences changed through time? I mean, anecdotally, mainly as a consumer, I think of the ways in which, like other foodstuffs, there's a lot of regionalization. We no longer speak, I think, rightly about Indian food, which has always been an invention, but about Punjabi, Gujarati, whatever different food forms. And of course, has there not this, in London certainly, and I can speak for other parts of the UK, for real market segmentation, differentiation. You know, the curry house, the balti house has a place and is very important, but it's certainly not the only. You can go high, you can go low, you can go sideways. Tell us briefly about how that relationship, particularly with women, has changed.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Thanks.
I think there is a lot to do with class in this conversation. First, I'll just say that the kind of relationship that's changed, the way that we look at curry houses is very different now. We might understand that a lot of them are also shutting down. They don't get the same sort of clientele. I think what's happened really is seeing this resurgence of food. Food is kind of reappearing in different ways. People get to travel more. There's obviously the effect of globalization. You're getting more ingredients. You're getting different kinds of ingredients. That kind of substitution that had to take place back in, say, the 60s and 70s is not necessarily what's happening now. So you've got much more specialized food. People have traveled more, so they've been to places like Goa. They realize that there's greater different types of food. It's more seafood based, and they can come back to places like the UK. And that sense of like globalization in a place like London is also a marker of like your cultural sort of superiority in a way, because you understand that these are things that are different, and that says something about the person that's also consuming the food. I think as it relates to gender and class, it's so interesting. Some of the conversations I had with women I interviewed, two of them have started restaurants and supper clubs, and they started through supper clubs. And they both had said that they actually didn't start in the food business. They were working, they had a PhD, they were working for the BBC or something like that. And eventually they realized that they wanted to go back to food. In the beginning, working elsewhere was an opportunity for them to take space elsewhere. These were middle-class women, upper-class women that had that opportunity. They had sort of the approval in a way of their families to take space elsewhere. So if you have that option, when historically it's obviously understood that women may not have had that option in the 60s, 70s, 80s, obviously many still don't, they were able to take space elsewhere, and then eventually came back to food as a recognition of their identity, as a recognition of, one of them said that they wanted to be custodians of their culture. So wanted to have this food business that is much more regionalized, that is much more specific. What I think is really interesting about that is part of what I've written about a little bit, and Jason and I have talked about this a lot, is sort of the resurgence of street food, but in restaurants. So we talked a little bit about pleasure, and it's one of those things that feels almost sanitized when you're having something like a pani puri or golgappa, which is very street food heavy. It's like a little crispy thing that you poke a hole in, like you drink it immediately. You're having a very social experience when you're standing on the streets and eating this in actual South Asia. And now you get it in restaurants because there is greater familiarity, there is greater availability of those ingredients, which is great. But then you're also sanitizing a little bit of that pleasure that you would normally get in like the street food setting. You're taking away the annoyance of the bugs around you, getting away from the annoyance of having to wait very patiently. You're obviously paying a much different price point as well. So the idea of taking space elsewhere became really important, but that is very class-based in that it's only available to some women. Other women that I spoke to that were asylum seekers waiting for any sort of understanding of their status in the country didn't really have that option. When we talked about belonging, they kind of looked at me like, yeah, I guess I don't really feel like I belong, but it's not even something that they have to consider. Food doesn't necessarily have that almost determined relationship. It's something that is there, but a bit more in the background.
Okay. Lucia, in your work in Peru, just to change the continent, what is the relationship that you're finding between food, citizenship, belonging, particularly as I understand amongst the mestizo population? So it's a specific part of the demographic in Peru.
Yeah, it is, but it's also the let's say dominant majority right now. But what I found really interesting in preparing for this research is looking at the history of the discourse around what it is to be Peruvian and the construction of that identity, if you can call it that, and the use of food and culinary culture around that. So it's been like 7,000 years of history, really. But from the moment of independence, about 200 years ago, it was really interesting to see how elites, mainly criollos or white elites, were trying to find a way of distinguishing themselves from their European fathers, grandfathers, and getting a bit more acquainted with all the different food styles that were in the country. So there's a lot of mixitude of food in Peru. There's a lot of influence of indigenous roots, different Europeans, so Spanish, French, Italian, very much Italian, African culture, obviously from people who were brought forcefully to the land and had to adapt their culinary traditions, and a lot of Chinese immigrants and a lot of Japanese immigrants. And all of that is what we call today Peruvian food. And the discourse, the search for Peruvianness was built around this idea of mixedness of all of these different influences. And around, today we see it around this idea of a harmonious kind of, we're all friends and look how it mixed together, and we're all one nation. And we all know as Peruvians that nobody ever felt that the country was one nation. There is a country that's extremely divided, class-wise, racially, ethnically. And it's interesting to see the contrast, I think, between that kind of almost national and now pretty official discourse, because the government has taken hold of that since the 2000s, early 2000s, and they developed a brand around it, Marca Peru, which is to attract tourists, but also to sell our food to the rest of the world. And it has done a huge amount of work, marketing-wise, research-wise, and development of the food industry inside the country to kind of develop this idea that one people united around these culinary traditions of that we call criollo food, so kind of mixed white food, but it has a lot of Black influence, it has a lot of indigenous influence. And what is really interesting is how those are being invisibilized in that discourse. And the contrast of that, you know, we love Peruvian food, we cook Peruvian food, so we are Peruvian. And the history of how these different communities within this system have negotiated their place with the use of culinary arts in a way. So that when they finish their indentured labor contracts in plantations, established what now you can find in every single corner of Lima is chifas, so Chinese Peruvian fusion food, and that is their food that we all enjoy. So there's a lot of let's say assimilation and homogenization efforts around food, and there are also a lot of resistance and individualization of individual communities around food.
Can I throw, I mean, I think you've given us a really amazing picture of the identities and all the mosaic aspects. I mean, I find, having never visited the place, but again, being a consumer of, say, Nikkei food of the Japanese, and how that overlaps with the Brazilian Japanese communities, and everything that you've described. Of course, the Afro-descendant influence is massive. But what about political subjectivities or subjectivities generally? How do culinary cultures allow you as a researcher to get to the heart of what subjectivity? I know that's a bit of a jargony term for those that are not social scientists, but good jargon sort of distills something quite complex.
Yeah, so because I am studying the way in which mestizos, so people who are identify as this kind of mixed ancestry people, can assimilate or can reproduce whiteness and white supremacy, but can also show markers and signs of resistance to it. I want to see how they relate to this discourse around food, how much they assimilate to that, the homogenization that it brings, but also how much they actually express resistance to that through other markers, like enjoying regional foods or enjoying, for example, street foods that are about mixing a lot of things that, you know, in the European canon shouldn't be mixed, because that's our thing now. Chicken with potatoes, with rice, with pasta in the same dish, you know, and different sauces. And so I'm wanting to see how people actually engage with those practices, to see how they actually relate to the system, to whiteness, to indigeneity, to Blackness. And that's my vector.
Fantastic. And I wanted to tie in, I hope not forcibly, to questions of ambivalence and mestizaje itself. The term itself suggests, or the fusion suggests, that there are multiple possible identities, that they appear, they present in different ways. And perhaps if we have time, we'll come back to that. But I wanted to bring in Rowan and Ronaldo and Maddie know that they're going to come in right at the end. So don't worry, we're not going to forget about you. But to try and link some of these more cultural aspects of belonging and identity to a slightly more political economic side of things, Rowan. I mean, your work has been around food sovereignty and vehicles like the Via Campesina, transnational, almost sort of trade union kind of movement. And yet that movement, for all its ideological focus, also has a great deal of variety and difference. So I wanted to hear what role identity plays in the formation of the different peasant groups. What are the implications for organizing across communities?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you say, the global food sovereignty movement, kind of under this banner called La Via Campesina, like the peasant way, arguably the most sort of strategically central infrastructure of struggle that we have for mobilizing rural peoples. But obviously with such, a big organization, it is sort of marked by this challenge of what you could call unity and diversity. No, and this is, of course, very often celebrated in left progressive circles, and so it should be, but with it comes certain costs. Some of the peasants I spoke to in Venezuela on their experience sort of engaging in this global organization sort of spoke about how different regions of the world, like from Asia or Africa or anywhere else, would carry very different kinds of politics, with Latin America probably being the most politically radical of all the regions within the sort of La Via Campesina mosaic. When Latin American peasants sort of speak of socialism within these global fora, very often their comrades sometimes meet them with some incredulity, or when some campesina activists speak of radical feminism, this may go over the heads of some of their other comrades that they're speaking to. So there's obviously no single correct politics to these diverse movements, but what this illustrates is obviously the relative challenge of bridging these divides across political and economic and cultural divides and so on. So in terms of thinking through this diversity, one sort of turn of phrase, again from Latin America, is this idea of diálogo de saberes, right? This sort of a dialogue of knowledges. And quite a striking example of this practice was kind of seen in Venezuela, in this kind of encuentro, in this encounter between peasant movements that came together in 2009 in Venezuela, in which the participants in this big group could be broadly categorized along three groups. One would be indigenous. This would be individuals kind of organizing and identifying around issues of territory, autonomy, and cultural heritage. There were those who just identified as campesino, just as peasants, people mostly organizing around issues of production and economic security, access to land, prices, and credit. And then finally, there was a sort of another subgroup, this sort of proletarian subgroup, mostly landless peasants, themselves sort of organizing through worker unions and collective schools and technical training centers. And I think the key is that even though all of these groups overlap in some way, particularly around issues of access to land, there are other issues such as the place of agroecology within their struggles, and things like what is the meaning of socialism to us, which was a little bit more contentious during this big meeting. And while kind of farmers like campesinos and rural proletarians actually frequently spoke of historical materialism as an intellectual resource in their struggles, some of their indigenous counterparts were a bit more skeptical, because they were thinking about the actually existing socialisms of the past that did not always shake out very well for indigenous peoples. But by the end of this encounter, which kind of stretched across 2 years, across two different venues, the participants eventually kind of came to this agreement that yes, socialism or historical materialism is just but one sort of cosmovision among many different cosmovisions, and that the relationships between them had actually quite deep roots that simply required nurturing in order for these kind of like shared understanding, shared strategies to emerge. So all of this is simply to say is that what sometimes appears as unbridgeable gaps that are anchored in identities that are themselves very often anchored in material contexts. The reality is that these kind of like, all of these identities, they kind of share like these tangled roots together, right? And what they really require through this constant sort of dialogue, through these constant encounters, is that these roots become suddenly unearthed, they become discussed, they come to light. And so, yeah, just through this process of encounter and dialogue, this seems to be the key first step for bringing these things together.
So let me press you a little bit on rootedness and place. I think one of the paradoxes that certainly this group of people and many others have been thinking through food is the paradox of universality. Think if anything, the food problem we have on the planet is superabundance, and the fact that there's food from anywhere at any time of the year, and yet the notions of identity are place-based. Those campesinos, those peasants, those direct producers of food have historically had very direct relations to a specific ecology. How does that play out in a system that is about long-distance food supply chains, food from nowhere, permanent summertime kind of food? Does it unsettle or fragment these identities and associations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. There's a lot to untangle. It's funny, the originator of the term, this term food from nowhere, it came from the French farmer and activist José Bové, who kind of shot to fame through kind of like this act of vandalism of dismantling this McDonald's that was under construction somewhere in the Pyrenees region of France. And he became somewhat of a celebrity among the sort of alter-globalization movement. But the way that Bové puts it is he says, the food is completely uniform. He's talking about McDonald's. The hamburgers have the same shape, the same content all over the world. In fact, it's food from nowhere, not even a degeneration of American culture. That's why McDonald's represents anonymous globalization with little relevance to real food. Now, this is kind of an interesting take from Bové, I think, because in his mind, McDonald's isn't even American, right? It's even more vacuous than this in some ways. It sort of melts into this faceless ether of globalization with all the risks that this sort of carries for health and culturally appropriate food, which is a favored turn of phrase within food sovereignty movements and elsewhere. So on the one hand, we can very much sympathize with his critique of food from nowhere. And while I think the problem of cultural flattening of some fast food chains is certainly an issue, I think almost more importantly is, as you say, precisely this problem of long distance food in terms of kind of like sustainability and so on, which is not just a problem of trade, but also of production, because really a lot of this comes back to the food system that was kind of created in the post-war period. It's like, in that direct moment, people were suddenly faced with this problem, again, that you gestured towards, Alex, this problem of surplus and starvation all in the same system. And kind of at this time when sort of US grain silos were sort of spilling over, they found this export safety valve in the form of like a variety of aid programs, and recipient countries who were sometimes in like genuine need. Every now and again, they really did need it for famine relief. What this really ended up happening is just overwhelming them with cheap imports. So there was a huge premium placed on amping production to meet national demands, for the demand for foreign exchange. And so we have this vacuum which enters the Green Revolution, these miracle seeds, high yielding varieties of seeds, and just this explosion of crop yields and all of the consequences that came with that. Now, it's interesting to note that food exports as a percentage of production has actually been going down since the 1960s, which I didn't know until recently. but total export volumes more than doubled between 2000 and 2022, so just in 22 years. So that gives you an idea of the immensity of this sort of like production treadmill, right? So all of this is to say that given that transport itself accounts for 20% of emissions within the global food system, and the global food system itself counts for a third of all emissions across the entire world, I think this should give us pause about long distance food in some ways, and the need to shorten our food circuits, right? And yes, perhaps with shorter food circuits, there may be an opportunity to reconnect with crops, with ingredients, with cuisines that maybe in some cases are slowly fading away in the face of this kind of faceless global system. So that's one side of the issue, but I'll end on the flip side of this. And this actually comes from a conversation you and I had in a pub a couple of years ago. And I think I ended the evening with a bit of a rant about how much food we fly in from abroad and how much better it would be for sustainability if maybe we focused a little bit more on consuming what we might grow nationally and all these kinds of things. And at which point Alex said, aha, yes, but what about all those communities in East London who literally rely on key ingredients like spices, herbs, various pulses that you just cannot grow in this country? And that really stopped me and got me thinking a bit deeper about the relationship between identity, sustainability, and most of all space, right? The space between us, between countries, but between people who share cities, who share civic space. So I think it's important to keep this impossible balance in mind in some ways, that long distance food, in my view, should always be minimized as much as possible, if not for the sake of sustainability separations, but equally important to remember that the movement of food also follows the movement of people, right? And so what this implies is that place-based politics, and indeed culturally appropriate food, is sometimes predicated on long distance food. So important to keep those two things.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll have time. I'm aware that we want to open the discussion up in, I think we'll probably go a little bit over 7 o'clock. But I wanted to pick up on place again and somewhat forced again, bring it to Rolando with science fiction, or the term that you prefer, I think, is speculative fiction, forgive me. And I associate that to non-places, to utopias. And I wondered what you could tell us about your own research in that realm of speculative fiction and what it tells us about food security today.
Yeah, well, so I look at, I guess I should preface that I look at it through kind of like a lens that incorporates the Caribbean, which is where I'm from. I was born in Cuba, but then also the Montana, so the West, which is the complete opposite. And I'm right now specifically looking at kind of the human and the animal dualism and how drastically different both places interact with that. And I guess where my research is headed towards is specifically the more that the more that we kind of blur what it means to be human, or what the concept of universal humanity means, and that has a bunch of layers to it as well, right? Like, who defines what the universal humanity is? I think the more that gets blurred, I guess I'm really interested in how we then approach meat consumption. So for example, if there's a book that I read recently, some of you might have heard it, Tender is the Flesh, which is a speculative world where we have now begun to consume humans as meat. And the way that the author, she's an Argentinian author, the way that she approaches it is through language and distance, right? So she adopts, the butcher shops adopt the language of meat production that we currently have, however you would, the graphs with like the cows, and it shows you like all the meat cuts. She applies that to the human body, and then with the distance between the consumer, people don't realize what type of meat they're consuming, and they go along with it, right? And so that for me is very interesting because I think it really reflects the way that current society approaches meat. There is so much distance between what we consume that we can't be 100% sure what's in our sausages, for example, right? And I think the more that we, as I was saying, the more that the concept of the human gets blurred and reimagined, I guess it just becomes that much more difficult to then say, is this carnivorism or is it cannibalism? It kind of starts to merge, and I think that's why I'm so interested in speculative fiction in particular, because I think it gives us case studies that may seem pretty radical, but they kind of aren't, especially not, in today's day and age. And then from the Caribbean point of view, you think about, you bring in Cuba in particular, it has such a huge African influence, especially with religion. And then you think of the sacrifices that are made, animal sacrifices made to certain deities, and this idea of gods consuming, or drinking the blood of humans or the blood of animals, and that I think is very fascinating as well for me.
Okay, so just again to press you a little bit on what's specific about this speculative literature, the power of language, the power of prefiguration, as I'm hearing it, of using speculation as a way to mirror back into our lived realities, and also the ethical dimensions, Rolando. I mean, what would you say your speculative fiction adds to these discussions? What is the angle that sort of illustrates or illuminates what our problem is?
Yeah, I think it's an attempt to move beyond a critique of anthropocentrism and essentially reimagine what it means to be a human. And because I think right now it's not so much that I'm trying to approach it in a way where I'm not trying to critique anthropocentrism, but I'm trying to suggest that we've essentially are operating in this bubble of a failed praxis of being, in a way. And so in order to move past that, we have to reimagine what it means to be a human in today's day and age, when there's just so many things that are reshaping our bodies, whether it's, the technology, the things that we consume, the food, all of that.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm seeing a lot of threads here, obviously distance, but also the ambivalences in this case between species and our relationship as human beings, and our definition vis-a-vis non-human nature. And I'm going to bring Maddie in, who started out doing a master's degree here, if I may say this, Maddie, just to, I think quite a few people around this table did a master's degree, and yeah, I forget that. But it's currently doing a PhD on, as Maddie was saying, on universality in school meals. But prior to that, you've done some work on allotments, a terrific master's dissertation that was a prelude to the work that you're doing now. And that's a very placeness issue. Some might even call it a slight utopia, a non-place that is full of power. What in your research was the impact of allotment gardens in London, and you looked at South London in particular, in terms of the tenants' food security?
Yes, so I have to say, I am an allotment garden holder, so it's an issue close to my heart, and I always thought about how allotment gardens can be a place of resistance and a place where people can operate their own agency and obviously sort of distance themselves from the traditional, whatever it is, dominant agri-food businesses. And that's why I went and did this research. And it was very interesting because when I interviewed allotment garden tenants, there were particular dimensions. So I looked at it through the lens of Cytopia. I don't know if you're familiar with the framework. So Caroline still uses this framework to look at urban planning and looking at city centres as through the lens of food and placing it at the centre. So when I spoke to the allotment tenants, there were particular dimensions that sort of came out as a surprise in a way, because I asked them about food security, but food security, I'm sure you know, it's very complex. It can be, you know, everyone has a different understanding, and I wanted to understand what they thought about food security, whether it was economic, whether it was cultural, and some of the dimensions that came out were about belonging and about inner community. It's a non-monetary system. It's for personal use. Obviously, you can't actually sell the products that you produce on the allotment, but it was also a way for them to operate agency and to look at growing crops that were not, you were talking about culturally appropriate, and growing crops that are some staples, the usual, potatoes, carrots, etc., but also crops that were not easy to find and that came perhaps from their own culture. So I had one of the tenants that was from Ghana, and she was growing a particular type of pumpkin that her mum used to prepare for her, and that was something that really made her happy. And so there was this sense of belonging. There's a lot of knowledge sharing and obviously seeds trading. So, again, we're talking about seeds and food sovereignty, and it's a very small, compact, we're not talking of a huge movement. But one of the things that I uncovered was that whilst the inner community was very, I guess, self-conscious and sort of in the sense of sharing knowledge, sharing resources, products, etc. The outer community was not part of that. So it's almost seen as a kind of status symbol. If you're an allotment holder, everybody thinks of the good life. If you've seen the show, it's this wonderful dream. It's not quite like that. It's many hours of hard work to get 3 potatoes, but it's the outer community that doesn't quite get included. And also in terms of participation and governance, there's a lot of conflicting interests because obviously it's public land that is rented out, but then there are contractors, and obviously all they want is to clearly minimize costs and do as least as possible. And then you've got the allotment tenants who really sort of look at their own small community, but they're not really keen in participating. The allotment association, the National Allotment Association, is non-political. It's basically just there to advise you on how to grow your crops, etc. So there's dimensions that don't quite materialize in terms of actually producing this resistance and this challenge to the agribusiness. So
I'm hearing that there's sorry to interrupt, but I'm hearing that, and there's been echoes of this, that there's always a danger of utopias being exclusive and even being minority in the worst sense of being privileged and isolated, and not dealing with the structural issues of inequalities and injustice. And yet your work now is looking more shifting from the food production, small production, often for leisure, into public provision. At the minute, school meals particularly, although there's overlap with prisons and hospitals and so on and so forth. What themes emerge there in terms of your understanding of food security, or your interest in this tension that we've been looking at between universality, the fact that you need to feed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children in London every day, and the fact that we have such rich and diverse communities?
Yes, so school meals are quite an emotional topic, I think, for many, and I think they tend to. I mean, there was obviously it was today in the news, the fact that accessibility has been changed, so they scratched the cap of £7,400, whatever it is, for children who can access school meals. So it's always quite a complex issue in the sense that, again, there are so many different levels of interest. So the Department for Education has published a school food strategy. It's very recent. Actually, I couldn't believe that nutritional standards were only introduced like 20 years ago. And it's the involvement of the Department for Education is very top line. They only provide guidelines. School meals are not monitored or enforced. They're not part of Ofsted. They're not part of the curriculum. So in reality, it's kind of sort of this from the top down, and it's also very inconsistent. You'll find boroughs, or even within the UK, you'll find that Scotland, for example, offers free school meals to all children up to year 7. In Ireland, the cap is 15,000, I think, for access. So, and even when there is an entitlement, there's still stigma attached to it, and only very few people actually. I think it's about 40% of children actually do apply for that. But London has a special status. Now, whether that's going to be renewed, I don't know, but the Greater London Authority has allocated free school meals to all school children from early years to year 7. This is supposed to end in July 2025. So we'll see. So it's a great opportunity to look at London as a case study, to look at universal free school meals in this sense. Part of the school food strategy is also looking at culturally appropriate foods. Now, I've yet to find a definition in official policy of what actually culturally appropriate foods are. So what I looked at is a sort of definition by in a paper by House and Al, which basically says that it's an interrelational relationship, and it's not only the type of food. So most people think, oh well, I'll just replace bread with rice, and that will be culturally appropriate for children that are from Asia or but it's not about replacing, and it's not about property of the food necessarily, but it's about how the food is consumed, when it's consumed, how it's consumed, and why. So it looks at different relationships and how how these relationships are formed. And school meals are very interesting as well because it's a public setting, but it also sort of enforces commensality. So if you think of the home as maybe the place for authenticity, where children actually form their social and cultural values and beliefs, when they are now presented in the school canteen, the rules are actually decided by someone else that isn't maybe from their culture, that isn't from their background, and they are enforced. And sometimes they can be contradictory. There will be things that are not quite what happens at home. So there is a little bit of tension there. I mean, I visited the school. I haven't started field work yet, so pending ethics approval. But I visited the school as a sort of preliminary work, and it was very interesting because I was talking with the headmaster, and I could hear that she was saying, well, we give the children really healthy food, but the parents don't support us. So there is this tension of the school thinks they are the holder of the knowledge and what is right and what is good nutritious food, and the parents think they are the holder of the knowledge. So that I'm interested to see what the children will actually make of it. So if I manage, I would actually like to do focus groups with primary school children and actually hear their lived experiences and what they think of the school meal provision, basically, and then do some ethnographical work as well, hopefully.
Thanks so much, Maddie. Thank you so much all, because there's so much to continue with, but I'm very mindful that we've got lots of people here that I'm sure have got ideas, questions, contributions. So I'm going to close it for the moment and open things up if you could just draw your attention to me, and can we take 2 or 3 interventions, and if you could say who you are, and if it's directed at a particular panelist, just point them out. Dilwyn, yeah. Tell us who you are.
I'm Dilwyn. I'm a Birkbeck PhD. No connection with food, and I'm a neophyte in this area. And I'm impressed by just how many dimensions there are to the issue of food. But I'd like to concentrate on the political economy one, and a question to Rowan. Clearly, in the sphere of manufactured goods, all the emphasis at the moment is on deglobalization and national security. And I think this was a trend even pre-Trump tariffs. I'm just wondering to what extent you think food might be an exception to that, or whether there are any signs of this taking place in food already, and that in sort of a perverse way, you might get to your more localization objective through rather questionable means. Right?
Yeah.
Let me, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to see if we can give you time to think as well. If there's other contributions at the minute, and we can bring them together. Yes.
Yeah, this is for.
Can you just tell us who you are? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Rory. I'm a master's student in political economy, and I'll be in your class next term. Yeah, I've spent. My partner is Polish, and I've spent quite a lot of time in Poland, and there they have these places called Bar Mleczne, which are these sort of canteens, and they're state sponsored, and when you go there, it's very interesting to see like the full class, like from every strata of society there. And I just wonder if there's a similar thing in the modern curry house, or whatever you want to call it, because you're talking about class, and there could be these class distinctions within that. Is there a sort of continuation of that from the past that has now been brought into the culture in the UK, that doesn't really see class anymore, and is this place that is common to everyone in that?
Thanks. Just checking that neither Sarah nor Ben online have questions. Yes, please.
My name is Ana Maria, and I work in food policy. I have experience across Latin America and the UK. My question is to you.
Ashima?
No.
Oh, Maddie, yeah.
Especially in food policy terms, when you were talking about what is culturally appropriate food is very challenging. And in some experience in indigenous communities, sometimes preschool meals, it was about understanding what is your cultural food, where are your crops that you belong to, and what makes like this appropriate to include in the preschool meals program. But in the case of the UK, I find it very challenging because it's a pot of mixed cultures. And one of the most interesting conversations I have had with proper British people with British background is which food do you belong to? Like usually when you ask people from Latin America, and when you said like people is very political about their food, like they say, well, I belong to my potatoes, I belong to my local crop, to my local recipes. But when you ask, like, for example, British families, I have received answers like, oh, I belong to fajitas, with no Mexican background or nothing, or I belong to curries, Indian curries. So what I find sometimes this easy connection about their local crops and local recipes does not happen that very fast. Thinking about in policy terms, here comes a question. If you can talk to a policymaker in very short time, a person that might have 5 topics in their agenda and don't go into these complexities of the conversation, what will you tell them about which type of principles should consider to have culturally appropriate preschool meals, for example?
Thanks so much. Ron, do you want to?
So this will be a very quick answer. No, it's not coming back. Because unfortunately tariffs don't work like that, as the poor GOP is slowly rediscovering day after day. No, I mean, Trump's current tariff policy is more likely to produce consumer price inflation rather than this new kind of like golden age of American manufacturing. So no, that's probably not going to be the effect. But I think something important to consider is that, yes, even if one were to, how do you put this, kind of like renationalize one's food system to the extent that you are simply shortening the food circuit, right? So you're closing that distance a little bit. That would be a good step, but then the real battle begins, because then you have to create a food system worthy of our support, worthy of its name. It's about the conditions under which that food is being made. And so then you're thinking about the rights of workers within processing, you know, unions, how they're able to form strategic links with, you know, workers on the farms, and then finally with consumers as well. So there's, you know, the real battle is actually creating these bonds of solidarity between different people who are working across the food chain, but whose immediate individual interests pursued to their maximal degree might actually work against the interests of people in a very similar economic condition, but working in a different end of the food chain to a certain degree. So yeah, shortening the circuit is really important, but then it's the conditions of that work, the conditions of that economy that really requires a lot of attention. But no, tariffs aren't going to do anything.
Okay. Did you want to come back on that?
No, I'm okay about it.
Yeah. Milk bars, curry houses.
Yes, the canteens. I would say in the South Asian context, the countries in South Asia where you see perhaps that class interaction the most is actually street food places, because those are types of foods that, yes, are being reproduced in restaurants, but they don't have that same kind of pleasure as I mentioned. So you still see a bunch of different people. You have somebody coming out of their BMW eating a pani puri in the same way that you'd have somebody who owns the shop next door who have that same food. I think in the UK, it's perhaps a bit more specific, or diasporas generally, it would probably be religious sites. So in popular religions in India, at least, Hinduism, Sikhism, there is a tradition of offering food in most religious practices. So in if you go to Southall, the Sikh temple, the Gurudwara there, they have langar, which is free meal service every day. And that does have very much a class interaction with people that can just have a meal after service or just go for the meal itself. Similarly, if you go to Hindu temples, they would have a very similar practice of just having food. So I think this class interaction probably happens in those spaces the most. Yeah, very quickly.
Thanks, Maddie.
Okay. So I'm trying to think of it's probably not the perfect answer. I agree with you. Yes, it's very difficult to define what is culturally appropriate in a city like London, especially because people will belong to many different cultural groups, and there might be religion involved, there might not, or there's also an individual sense of identity. I think if I was looking at it from a policy-making point of view, I would say, first of all, I think school meals should be integrated in the national curriculum, and they should also have food education as part of the curriculum. I think many Latin American countries, certainly, Brazil is sort of trailblazing in this sense, but in India as well, they have food education as part of their curriculum, and that enables, I think, or empowers the children to have, first of all, to learn about the different foods, etc., but also to have more agency in terms of what they actually relate and they think is culturally appropriate. And for me, I think also in allowing the children to actively participate. And I know that everybody thinks of, oh gosh, the thought of a 7-year-old designing a menu, but they are very capable of actually, explaining and understanding what nutritious food and telling what is correct and what is not. So it's possible. I wouldn't say that I let them design, but at least allow them to participate and give them a little bit of agency as to what they can, they can design in the school meal, because I think at the minute it's just mandated. We have a contractor that really isn't particularly interested in culturally appropriate foods, aside from, as you say, maybe have a Mexican day, and also this has a Mexican day, which is really interesting because there are no Mexican children in that school. But anyways, so I think it's Taco Tuesday or whatever it is. So I think it needs to be, there needs to be a little bit more freedom, and it needs to be a little bit more localized. And I'm talking of the ideal world. I don't know if that's physically possible, but that's where I see myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think what comes across, if I may, very strongly in what you've just said, Maddie, I don't know if you wanted to come back on this, but is that food is not just fuel, especially for growing for children. It is it's a learning moment. It's a moment of commensality, of socialization, et cetera, which I think, you know, at one level, those of us that are involved in the food world is a commonplace, but though that imaginary and perhaps not so imaginary official doesn't always hear, you know, they think about calories, but not necessarily about the longer term benefits of commensality in a public domain. But sorry, I didn't want to.
No, absolutely. I think it's a lot of the standards look at nutritional, nutritional values, etc., which is great, because clearly, 10, 20 years ago, turkey Twizzlers and all of that. I'm sure everybody remembers the scandal. But I think that it cannot just be that. It has to be also in terms of, as I said before, how the food is consumed, why it's consumed, other particular rituals or particular meals, and I think the involvement of the children has to be there at some level.
As I said earlier, if you don't mind, we're going to extend things a little bit. Conversation, at least for me, is still alive and interesting. So I don't know if people want to. Please.
My name's Neil Brown. I did some philosophy here a long time ago, but not really relevant. I worked in sustainable impact investing for a while, and I just wondered, we looked at, if you like, the nexus between water, energy, and food on the basis that you use water to produce food, use land, sort out your water, energy for both, etc. And if we look at, 10 years away, we're going to have significant water shortages in too much of the world. Water stress in quite a lot of places already, and not just sub-Saharan Africa or the usual sort of victims. We also have a burgeoning global population. I was wondering if anyone was going to talk on the panel about how agriculture might have to evolve to meet that need, even if we assume we stop wasting quite so much food as we currently do.
I mean, I'm
not pointing at anyone.
No, I realise that, and
that's a bit unfair.
That's part of my role. I'll be the culprit here, and I'm looking at Rolando, but in a very roundabout way, because you mentioned Dune earlier, and also in your research, you look at machines eating, and you're interested in why machines in the speculative fiction consume and eat, and in my mind, anyhow. One thing that machines eat is water, right, and all kinds of other resources, as Rowan was saying. I mean, in a way, whether we're vegans, vegetarians, or not, we all eat carbon because of the agri-food system being so dependent on carbon in all kinds of ways. So I'm gonna go in that direction, Rolando. I know that's.
Yeah, I'll try to answer it as best as I can. One thing, I guess, that I think about quite often in my research is, when you develop these ideas of sustainable energy or utopias, let's say, right, where you have technologies that are producing food or whatever for certain societies, there's like a trickle-down effect where the societies that then end up suffering the consequences of that utopia tend to be the societies that, like the global south, are the ones that feel the impact. In a lot of ways, when you think about, the global north, when the global north kind of considers what would be a dystopian society, and I'm basing this off of books, movies, things that we're all exposed to, right? They're very real things that are currently happening. And so that conflates this idea of, well, what is a dystopia if the things we're scared of, right, like water scarcity, is already happening, and it's the reality, the lived experience of so many places in the global South. And so I guess that is a fascinating, like a kind of a crazy thing. But bringing it back to the machines, I think that this might be a little unrelated, might be a bit of a disconnect, but machines and the consumption, specifically, I'm thinking of, I'm giving you guys a reading list. You know, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep utilizes electric animals, and the fact that they can eat is how the narrator establishes his own humanity or his own status within his building. And I think right now, I think the way that we interact with AI, it's based off of language, empathy, and communication as the thing that bridges the gap between humanity and machines, right? But one thing that speculative fiction is doing is bringing food into it, right? So rather than saying, okay, you know, a machine has successfully tricked the human into thinking that it's a real being, it shifts towards the machine is tricking the human via its ability to consume food. And I guess that doesn't really answer the question, but that's like a very broad, I guess, connection back to machines and eating. I do think 10 years from now, the food insecurity is going to get much worse because that need for AI and machines to deceive us as humans is going to it's going to incorporate food, right? So once machines start eating, which sounds crazy, but I think that's going to be the next thing that I guess is going to be like married with machines to convince us of their humanity, rather than right now where it's language, communication, and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Fascinating. Does anybody else want to come in on this? Rowan, I suspected you might do briefly.
I mean, I will,
Yeah.
briefly. I'll try.
Like is the wrong word.
Yeah, so you said, you know, with all of these resource constraints, where is the global food system going to need to go? I mean, I would say, roughly speaking, it would need to go something like the route of what today we might call degrowth, right? This is a bit of a contentious topic, even among sort of left-wing or left progressive intellectual circles and political circles. I, for one, am quite sympathetic to degrowth arguments. And the reason being is precisely because of what we're talking about here. What we're talking about are the inputs that go into systems, that go into agricultural systems. And these are what you can also call throughputs, right? Now, the problem that we currently have is that within the current economic system in which we live, because of this sort of growth imperative, right? It means that your rate of throughput always has to increase, right? So it's not just that we use a lot of stuff, it's that the rate at which we use the stuff always has to increase. It's the lifeblood of the system. So that needs to be geared down. I mean, again, this unimaginable growth of AI, these huge server farms that power these machines are incredibly thirsty systems, right? It's a massive diversionary thing. We need to cut all that down. Right, we just need to get rid of all that crap. I mean, look, I'm not a Luddite or anything, but we don't fucking need like what does it eat? It's a search engine. That's what it is. Like we got along perfectly well before ChatGPT, for Christ's sakes. Anyway, sorry, I'm just ranting a little bit. But like, I would much prefer to drink a glass of water than to ask ChatGPT something. But just on this, you also, you know, mentioned that there's, you know, we have like growing populations and blah blah. It's actually interesting. We don't have we kind of have an underpopulation. Like the rate of population growth is going down across the entire world. Weirdly enough, it's still growing, but at a much, much lower rate, and it's going down over time. Almost every part of the world, which sort of raises demographic issues. Like we have this inverted demographic pyramid. It's a bit complicated. The one place where we have an overpopulation problem is the population of billionaires. There are just too many of them. We need to just cull them, right? That's what we really do. Get rid of them, And half the battle is won, right? In terms of consumption, in terms of resources, in terms of conservation. So this is kind of what I'm talking about degrowing the system. It's not about general austerity for everyone. It's about radically degrowing the things we really don't need, while at the same time sort of complementing that with actually regrowing certain things that we might need. Public services, shared infrastructures, urban allotments, like urban gardening, all kinds of things that you can grow, that you can develop, and so on. But that would be something that we might need to start thinking about, is just growing that, like degrowing what we just don't need.
Thanks a lot, Brian. You asked. Okay, I'm going to take a final round of questions. We've got one here.
I suppose building slightly on that.
Can you just tell us who you are? Sorry.
My name's Alex. I have an interest in lots of things. In terms of tying a few things together, we have a vision of maybe an imagined future of what might be good. We're not there. There's a distance from A to B, and I think the term sometimes uses transition pathways. Touching on, I think the expression you used was closing on smaller circuits, food circuits, and also tying in the identity of more globalized and diverse communities. Obviously, there's a challenge between closing a food circuit, keeping it globalized, keeping it non-homogeneous in the way that somewhere like London is. I think the word was sort of summer food.
Permanent summertime, yeah.
Permanent summertime. When you think about large portions of the global south, they're structured towards feeding our permanent summertime. And in that transition pathway point, you sit there and go, if we start eating locally and seasonally, we will harm the global south in the short term, depending on the J-curve. So my question really is, how do we hit all of those points, and how do we transition in a way that, as you've said, has degrowth without being harmful? And if so, what does that look like? I feel like that's quite a big question. So sorry, I'm looking at you first, but also Alex as well, if she has an opinion.
But a terrific question, and I'm getting, I mean, just transition is two words that might fit into here, but yes.
Yes.
My name is Cassandra. I'm creative writing PhD, finished a few years ago. Riffing off that, I lived in Guatemala. I think the problem is that when countries are supplying other countries, they neglect their own subsistence crops.
Yes.
So that although in the short term it may seem like we're harming by not buying snow peas or avocados or whatever we import from countries, they're unable to feed their own populations because currently they're producing stuff to feed other people. So the other question, which is more of a sort of general thing, I don't know if other people feel like this who are older, but looking at the markets that we have in London at the moment, you used to be able to get a lot of fresh, raw vegetables and fruits specifically that you could create and make your own meals from. And it seems to me that the big transition in London, having been away for a long time and coming back, is everything. You go to a farmer's market, for example, around the corner here today, and everything is food prepared in a meal. And there's one stall selling a few lettuces, and there's almost no available fresh fruit and vegetables. This is kind of concerning me because I think it's a reflection of the direction we're going, and you all sort of feed into that in different ways. I'm just really interested in whether there's been research done on that or thinking along those lines.
Okay, I'll take those two final questions. I had one point here, if I may, just abuse the proverbial, which is about again a little piece of jargon, but strategic essentialism. What this means is that in the wonderful array of different identities, indigenous, Afro-descendant, Nikkei, all these different, the confluence of different peoples, does the market present, food market in particular, including the brand Peru, an opportunity to say, I present myself as the indigenous Peruvian, or as the Afro-descendant Peruvian to the global, to a global market? In a way, this is an essentialism that is kind of there strategically to sell, right? But let's go, I think, Rowan, I think you got some of the, I don't know if you wanted to speak to Alex's point briefly again, but let me ask Lucia first.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I go first.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to on this question.
There's a little bit of that in Peru. It's for political and historical reasons less strong in Peru than in other Latin American countries, actually. This kind of identification with certain indigenous roots, and it is growing now. The national effort has been presenting that as Peruvian, as one homogeneous identity. but people have been, for political gains and reasons, starting to identify as Quechua or Aymara or Afro-Peruvian, but it's more in the realm of activism and kind of unions and that sort of thing, not so much on the food side of things.
Is there a reason for that, do you think? Why food? Why not food? But sorry.
I guess so. So the reduced kind of community identification, especially in the indigenous scene, seems to come from the agrarian reform. In 1969, plantations were expropriated from rich white families, and the land was given to the people that actually worked the land. But in the same regime, in the same movement, there was an effort for ethnicizing the language, and we stopped calling people Indian or indigenous. We started calling them campesinos or peasants, and it was more of a class-based identification than an ethnic identification. And it kind of comes from that, but I think it kind of ties into the questions here about degrowth, and because there's an interesting bit of conversation in Peru going on in the last few years, where there's this idea that actually the whole like industrialization of the system and food systems is harming the country and is harming the environment, and that most of our locally consumed food, not the one for export, is actually coming from more like subsistence models of farming, and a small landowning families that kind of sell to a middleman and then go to Lima, sell the food. Limanian food doesn't necessarily come so much from the big industries that are exporting to Europe or the US. And there's a little bit of a conversation about how do we actually protect that, and how do we actually foster that and protect the people who are working in those ways instead of giving preference to the big industries. And that's a really interesting conversation. There's a lot of resistance, obviously, because this idea of how do we transition without harming people in the global south, I think the main people that would be harmed in that transition would be the elites and the middlemen, not the actual subsistence farmers that would, be able to kind of redirect their efforts and grow their own food and sell some of their products. But it's the landowners, the corporations, and the people who do the logistics of sending food away who would be harmed. And well, I mean, there's always kind of collateral damage. So there's that question. I don't have an answer for that, but it's a really interesting kind of start of the conversation in Peru and the movement, and it is tied with people who are identified as campesinos and sell their own products as in their regional food. And there's a little bit more of interest in that. It also ties, I think, just to finish really quickly, with identity, I think, because how do we see ourselves? Urban Peruvians really wish that they can become European. I'm not like, this is just like true. We tend to want to be a developed industrialized country, and we see ourselves as that, as we're in that movement. And there's a whole thing of not just like dismantling the system, the material system, and letting go of some of those materials aspirations, but also how do we see ourselves and our identity, actually. So it's a whole work thing to be done around that.
Okay. Massive questions, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm kind of loath to not because I'm sure there'd be great answers, but because of time, to open things up, unless any of you want to add any final comments. I want to thank you all for coming here. As you can see, some of my colleagues have left Birkbeck, but Birkbeck hasn't left them, and that can be the case for you as you leave this building. Do follow up if there's questions, or if you've got things that you'd like to pick up with any of the speakers, and please join me in thanking them for their contributions.